Somewhere all of this is thrown into one bag, covered up, and it's kind of a taboo topic.
Being alone and being lonely.
Having space to think about who we want to be, where we want to go, and what we want in life.
We use something like fast food relationships.
Every emotion that we don't let out, that we don't process, will eventually manifest as some kind of illness.
Our gut flora, the bacteria living in our intestines, actually controls our lives, our hormones, and our cravings.
And for example, do a test, see, find out, okay, what would it advise me here, right? Respirit me.
Sylvia, hello darling, and please introduce yourself. Tell our viewers who you are and what you do.
Hello, Natalia. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk. My name is Sylvia Szczesniak. Hello, everyone. I am the co-founder of the Respirit Me platform, which supports human well-being. Privately and also professionally, of course, I am an architect. I work with neuroarchitecture, and I also popularize this knowledge. It is a combination of neurobiology and psychology, so people are also very close to my work. That's where my passion for the Respirit Me platform comes from, as well as involving therapists and natural methods with people who are seeking support.
That's really great. Thank you so much for your initiative, because I think it will be very helpful for many people who are looking for solutions for themselves, who are looking for experts. And the fact that you can find such people in one place, well, that's just great. But today we want to talk to you about loneliness. Please tell me, is loneliness in general still a taboo topic these days, or is it becoming more and more popular? How do you see it?
That's a very good question. I myself come from a place where I struggled with loneliness and processed this topic very deeply. I think, by the way, that research also shows this, and in the context of W. Przestrzeni and Respirit Me, we conducted such studies. And yet this loneliness, even though I think it's a taboo topic in general, and what I see happening in the way social media is perceived, right? Where they try to communicate it in such a way that being lonely isn't a bad thing, it's something wonderful. However, I still think the problem goes deeper here, because being single and being lonely are two different things, and it's worth distinguishing between them. And I think that today there's a lack of awareness that everything is just thrown into one bag and covered up. And it's a bit of a taboo topic, covered up by this idea of being single, that it's so great that you can find yourself, but somewhere people forget about themselves. They forget about themselves. And even the research we conducted with people who came to us, they would complete a basic questionnaire so we could help them figure out which direction they should go. A very large percentage of these people pointed to loneliness, to the frustration connected with loneliness, because we have to remember that loneliness is largely associated with this kind of frustration, and what follows from that is depression. Of course, this can be categorized in different areas of unresolved emotions, unresolved patterns, even family ones, but still, I think that in terms of social media and communities, it's a taboo topic. However, it's an increasingly serious issue that brings huge consequences for our entire society.
Exactly. You said something very interesting, that it's like being alone and being lonely. It's all lumped together. So how can you tell the difference, in your opinion, from your point of view, when someone is alone by choice and when it's already loneliness? How is it different? For someone who, for example, has never dealt with this, or even for someone who is alone, so they can determine whether they feel lonely, what does it even mean? Or maybe it's actually good that at this moment they're alone, and maybe in some way it's good for them. How can you even tell the difference?
I'll put it this way, I think. I'll say it using my own example, because I won't hide that the sense of lack I felt was actually a strong feeling of loneliness, in the sense of not feeling whole with myself. I think it's pretty important to mention that. Let me explain what I mean. I remember it like it was today, how for years I felt such deep loneliness, such emptiness. And I felt that if I wasn't with someone, if I wasn't with another person, if I wasn't surrounded by people, friends, family, if there wasn't always someone by my side in this life, no matter who it was, I would swap partners for girlfriends, friends, acquaintances, and there was always some kind of filler. As long as we feel that emptiness, that lack, and the depression that comes with being alone, that's the kind of loneliness that affects us negatively. And that's my perspective. However, when we feel complete with ourselves, when we are able to, because it's great that you mentioned this, Natalia, that sometimes we really need that time. And what's interesting is that when we work through certain problems that exist within us, no matter where they come from, like from a certain moment in life, because these don't even have to be our own problems, they can be family issues, right? So we carry a kind of burden from our family line and we go through life with it. It may turn out that if we don't resolve this, we aren't really able to feel that sense of wholeness. And here, I'll be honest, I was such a case myself because I had a huge sense of lack, both from my childhood and also from my family history, which I simply had to dig up, release story after story and bring light to them. I felt that lack, and whenever doors closed, I tried to look for different substitutes. And unfortunately, it can also happen that we look for those substitutes not only in people, but in stimulants, in food, for example. And we try to fill the void of that loneliness without understanding where it comes from. So until we reach those areas that need to be filled, to bring light to understand why we feel that emptiness and loneliness. Of course, we won't be able to spend time with ourselves, of course, alone, right? I mean, truly alone in that fullness, right? And what I think is important is that every person needs time alone with themselves. And it's also very important to remember that we need this time to have space to think about who we want to be, where we want to go, and what we desire in life. These are the three basic questions that one of my teachers always repeats, right? Who are you? Where do you want to go? And what do you desire in life? If we don't spend time alone with ourselves, we're not able to ask ourselves these questions. But at the same time, when we lack this, we don't know how to be alone. It's like a closed circle. As for loneliness itself, what's quite funny and also sad at the same time is that until we fill this emptiness, we can't create full, true relationships where two complete people meet. Of course, we can call it two halves of an orange, but we're still whole because when we look at a sliced orange, it's still whole from the front, right? And that's interesting too, because it was the same in my life. The moment I truly felt whole within myself and the moment I felt, okay, actually now I don't really need anyone anymore. And suddenly it turned out that this completion came to me, right? And I managed to create this conscious, whole, beautiful relationship, which is what we're really looking for in our loneliness and frustration, right?
So to sum up, a person can be alone because, for example, they need it, because they feel good with themselves, because they need it for regeneration, for some relaxation, for some personal growth, or to pursue their passion. But when in that solitude or being alone, you start to feel bad, start to feel some frustration and a really strong lack of that other person, like you said, that sense of not being understood or maybe feeling like an invisible person, that's when we're talking about the kind of loneliness we want to get rid of. Okay, but tell me, because you mentioned that you did some kind of research or tests, did you pay attention to a cross-section of society? Who most often has these problems with feeling or experiencing loneliness, with being lonely?
That's interesting because even for the purpose of this conversation, I prepared a few studies that were also the basis of our analysis. And for example, what's interesting is that Centrum Badania Opinii Społecznej indicates here that not only adult Poles, but also Poles aged 18 to 34. So look, Natalia, how young people have a problem with chronic loneliness. So we're not just talking about older people like before, people over 50, but we're also dealing with young people. I think that to a large extent, I don't know what you think. I'm also curious about your opinion. We have the space of the internet here, which simply cuts us off a lot from these contacts, these interpersonal relationships. I even look at my own daughter, who is now 8 years old, and I see how her environment, I'm not saying the whole environment, but it's moving towards these online contacts. That online contact is already starting. YouTubers are starting. Those kinds of communications are starting, like I'll just stay at home, watch something, or communicate with someone. In my opinion, it's terrifying because research clearly shows, right, that it's not just older people anymore, but we also have people aged 18 to 34, and that's where we have the highest rate of chronic loneliness. Look, I think we're actually entering a certain pattern. I'm saying this is my perspective, but maybe even a disease, because when something is chronic, we're already touching on some symptoms of illness, right? So definitely, also answering that first part you mentioned about organizing things, I think that when someone listening to us today feels that this loneliness isn't just being alone with yourself, I think that's the moment when you should start looking for help.
You know what you said about the internet, I even heard someone say that nowadays we have something like fast food relationships. Fast food makes us think of food, quick food that's usually unhealthy, and this fast food of relationships is also quick and unhealthy when there's no depth, when it's more like, hi, I know you, but I don't form any deeper bonds. That's exactly what the internet is. It definitely has a huge impact on why young people feel lonely, because you would think that young people have their own company, whether at school or in different clubs, since kids go to all sorts of activities. But still, as you said, statistically, this is the group where loneliness happens very often. It means they feel misunderstood and don't build those strong relationships. And it's also interesting why this happens, why these deep relationships aren't being built. Is it because we're afraid to enter into these relationships, or do we simply lack time because everything is such a rush, everything is fast, or maybe we want to meet certain expectations, whether it's society's expectations or our parents, and somewhere along the way we don't talk about our problems, our issues? I think that's one of the main reasons for all of this. When we don't let out what's on our mind, in our soul, in our heart, and just keep it inside, we very often end up feeling misunderstood. And we can't find that other person who would think the same way as we do, who would live through the same things, because how could they know what I'm going through if I don't talk about it? Because on the internet, it's trendy to talk about what's cool, what's pretty, what's pleasant, what attracts attention, to show that I'm not worse than others. Maybe that's connected to it. But I'll tell you, I was convinced that it's mostly older people who feel this loneliness. How is it in general with that group, based on what you saw in your analyses?
Let me explain. When it comes to groups, actually all groups are at risk of loneliness. And in general, older people are definitely shown in this study as well. However, the reason I touched on the younger ones here is because it really surprised me, because it's exactly what you said, right? You could say, oh no, it's only the older groups, right? People who have problems with loneliness, but it turns out that actually the younger groups do too. Now, what's interesting is if we go further with what I'm thinking, since these younger groups, just like you said about the internet, have a problem with loneliness, even these groups, then what must it be like in the older age groups? And that's exactly right. The groups over 50, 40 plus, 50 plus show much higher levels of loneliness. And here, this loneliness comes from other aspects as well. For example, unfortunately, we often experience different kinds of breakups, divorces, children growing up, people separating, right? We end our professional careers, we move on to other paths in different ways. We change the social structure around us, our bubble, and friendships also drift apart. And also these studies show that what's happening today and what is worth paying attention to is that we really don't want to deal with difficult emotions, right? Everyone on social media says, no, we just smile, I'm an oasis of calm, whatever you say to me, right? That's your negative projection. I'm calm, wonderful, and nothing should affect me. I have to forgive everyone. Unfortunately, no, that's not exactly how it works. And I also often talk about this with various therapists. And I'm also training very intensively in coaching at foreign schools, where we actually have to work with these emotions, because every emotion that we don't take out of ourselves, let's say, or don't let pass through us, will eventually manifest as some kind of illness. And also, what I think is worth mentioning in response to your question about where this whole issue of loneliness comes from, I think that too. And that fast food you mentioned, I think it's also connected, listen, to eating, because I believe, and I'm an example of this myself, when I used to eat a lot of processed food, I wasn't taking care of my mental diet either, right? That is a conscious, holistic detox, like a detox from social media, for example, meaning the time when you're not scrolling. Because where does this relational fast food come from? We're just used to quick content, right? Reels on Instagram, up to 30 seconds, because we already lose our focus, right? Fast food here, you can order food and someone will prepare something for you. Processed, you go into a store and everything is just at your fingertips. No one really pays attention to what you're feeding yourself with. I mean, I won't hide that I feel like it's slowly starting to change now, thanks to people like you, for which I'm super grateful, because I won't hide that I was someone who ate unhealthily. I ate on the go. I would say, oh, it's fine. I listened to all those diet gurus, all that, right? The whole world. But I thought, what's going to happen if I have some processed food on the way, right? Will I eat it? Well, it suddenly turned out that when I started doing a detox on myself, I started looking deeper inside myself. And suddenly everything slowed down, not just the eating, but also cleansing the intestines, which you also talk about, is very important. It's our second brain. Suddenly you have mental clarity and a clear mind, and you begin searching for that depth. And it's so amazing that everything is connected, right? That we look at it like, okay, let's say, for example, I have women in my academy, right? Women who come to change their path, women over 50. And she sits in front of me and says, listen, I feel lonely, right? I changed the path of my life. I'm overwhelmed by this. I feel lonely. I'm overwhelmed by what's happening. I can't find my way. And then I ask a question. And suddenly it turns out that, in fact, there's a lot of internet before bed, processed food, eating on the go, irregular meals, coffee to start the day, right? And suddenly it turns out that the result of all this is that frustration, that loneliness, which will soon turn into depression. Or maybe it's already there, but the cause is actually somewhere else, isn't it? And then we get into this kind of research. We look at this human well-being report, which we recently conducted as part of Respirit. And it turns out that, in fact, the problem is much, much deeper. And it doesn't just affect one specific group that everyone knows has this problem somewhere, but even young people, right? I'll also tell you an interesting thing that I read in the research. It turns out, and actually I talked to therapists also with Respirit Me, with an older married couple, a lot of parents come to them with their children, listen, who feel lonely, whose young children are already starting to have depression, maybe not so little, but actually from around 10, from the age of 10 and up, the problem starts. Something that I feel just didn't exist 15 or 20 years ago, right? The question is, where does it come from?
Exactly. You see, we used to talk about loneliness, that it was more about, well, someone gets divorced and the woman or the man feels lonely, feels misunderstood, abandoned. Or the empty nest syndrome, when parents really devoted their whole lives to their children and suddenly the children grow up. It usually happens very quickly. They leave the nest and the parents feel like, okay, what am I supposed to do now? Who am I supposed to take care of? There's also that emptiness, and then a person can feel lonely when someone loses or a loved one dies, someone is left alone. Well, that's kind of logical. However, the fact that even with a complete family, someone in the family or a child feels lonely, Well, that's actually a very complex problem. And I think, like you said, that it's the internet and our pace of life. And, well, not to make it sound like it's the parents' fault or not the parents' fault, it's probably just our pace of life that we don't really get into deeper relationships with our children, because it used to be different. Everything was different. We functioned differently. We even built relationships with our friends differently. I remember times when there were no cell phones, and even landline phones weren't in every home. And to go to a friend's place for coffee or tea, you didn't have to call and make an appointment 2 weeks in advance to see if she had time and if we would meet. You would just go to the store, buy something, maybe some cookies so you wouldn't come empty-handed, knock on the door, and if she was home, great, I dropped by for coffee. If she wasn't home, oh well, I'll come next time. That's how it was, but now it's completely different. Now we make appointments, and very often it's like, oh, that date doesn't work for me, or that date doesn't work for her, and we see our friends only once in a while. And what do we talk about? We talk about the weather, what's generally going on. We don't get into those really deep relationships, into those emotions. And it's the same with children. A child comes home from school with a head full of all kinds of information and all sorts of feelings. They want to share it with their parents, but the parent is too busy then. Since many just return from work and some work remotely, they're constantly busy with other tasks or side jobs, so life space definitely affects them. Then there's what you mentioned about eating. It's extremely important that our gut flora, the bacteria living in our intestines, actually controls our lives, our hormones, and our cravings. Depending on what we feed it, that's the kind of flora we'll have. Either the healthy kind that supports us and our health, or unfortunately the pathogenic kind that can make us sick. So you see what can be done here, because you said that sometimes women come to you and during the conversation they say they feel lonely. I think that's already a pretty good sign that she's able to identify what she's feeling and how she's feeling. I think it's even worse when a person who actually feels lonely doesn't even realize what's happening to them. And she asks herself, what's happening to me? What's wrong with me? What did I do wrong that, for example, my relationship isn't working out, or things aren't going well at work, or in general, life just isn't the way I would like it to be. I'm just not satisfied. And what can you do in this situation? What advice can you give to someone like that when, for example, at this moment she just says, something in my life isn't right, how can she cope? What would you advise, since you say you've been in a similar situation?
Oh, darling, let me tell you this. I would definitely advise against seeking help from friends or girlfriends, because, of course, that's always very valuable support. But I think that in such a situation, and I'm speaking from my own experience, I wasted a lot of time, many years thinking, being convinced that, okay, I know something is wrong, something just isn't working. But, I was filling the void first with food or substances or different kinds of relationships. And at first it was just these so-called fillers. That's what I would call them, Then there was this moment, because usually I feel like it happens this way. Life eventually forces us at some point to finally make a decision. And I kept pushing this issue away, kept pushing it away. I was constantly frustrated until I actually ended up alone in the 4th month of my pregnancy. In a way, it was my own decision, because honestly, the relationship was quite toxic. And here, without blaming either side, it always takes two people to attract each other, and something just had to be done about it, right? And I'll say this, today, when I think about it, I realize I had a lot of warning signs, first orange flags, then red ones, telling me to do something about it, but I was afraid to face it. I think it's also worth talking about this fear that we are often afraid. We feel that something is wrong, but we're a bit scared, like I say, to lift up the rug and look underneath. We're in this place, where on one hand we feel that something isn't right, we're not happy, we feel some discomfort, unease, maybe the beginnings of depression, or maybe we're already in depression. And we just don't want to take that next step. Why? Because it's very hard to face that first phase. Often because our ego will block us. Ego blocks us. It's a mechanism that, well, on one hand is supposed to protect us, because ego is there to create safe, let's say, boundaries for us, like, hey, you're supposed to survive. I'm here to help you survive. So don't jump off that roof, right? Don't go into the fire, right? Because you'll die, right? But when we actually need to work on ourselves, the ego uses the same mechanism. It says, don't go there, because I'll die, because I, as the ego, will die. Yes, this identity will change a little, but for the better. Of course, there's always relief afterwards. What can you do in such a moment? In my opinion, you just have to be brave. You have to be courageous for yourself, because this situation will catch up with us sooner or later. And probably for some women at the least pleasant moment for them, meaning it will lead to divorce, it will lead to some kind of breakup, right? The place where she is, maybe she will start living with severe overweight because, for example, that will be the filler, right? The thing that fills the void. Maybe she will fall into some kind of addiction, right? It doesn't always have to be alcohol. It could be sugar. It could be, excessive screen time. There are really a lot of these things nowadays. And she will just get stuck somewhere. And if I can give anyone any advice today, then after listening to us here, after this conversation, pick up the phone. There are 1,000 possibilities. And for example, there is the Respirit Me platform. I even think that your book is a great place to start, because there's this cool mechanism that when we're afraid, let's say, to face our demon head on, we can go around it. We can start with small things like I did in a way, because pregnancy is a moment when you have to start paying attention to what you eat, right? Because you're not just eating for yourself anymore. So for me, it all started with the diet. I had to give up all stimulants, including alcohol, which absolutely cuts us off from our own awareness. I often meet women who say, oh, I just have a glass of wine in the evening, just one, it doesn't hurt me, and then I eat healthy during the day. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way, because there are also studies on this topic. I highly encourage you to check them out. We can even link them to this episode later if you'd like. They did research on how they studied sleep in different environments, and how just one glass of wine affects sleep. We don't sleep, we can't enter the rapid eye movement phase after just one glass of wine, which means we can't, and sleep is necessary for us to regenerate, right? We can't regenerate, so really, if you drink a glass of wine, you can be sure that night won't be a restful one, you'll just pretend you slept, right? And it's amazing that I, of course, had to start with this diet, because fate, let's say, motivated me to do it in a beautiful way, no matter how you look at it. But it gave me this awareness, and what I could say to a woman like that to motivate her if she's very afraid and needs to find the strength to dare to move forward. Start with this diet. Reach for your book, Conscious Detox. Start with a detox. The changes will come on their own, because I went through this path myself. I know how the diet affects you. I know how I feel today. Listen, what's interesting is that I won't hide it. Sometimes I slip up and eat some chocolate because I love chocolate. I won't deny it. But the way I feel that sugar the next day, I just feel a lack of mental clarity, even in my head. So if I were to recommend something, I would suggest starting at least with food. And then maybe join us on our platform. That's why we created it. And for example, take a test, get an idea, go around this topic. Okay, so what would you advise me here, right? Respirit Me.
Great. So yes, diet, detox, take a test, and if needed, look for a specialist. I understand that on your platform you can actually find such a specialist, because if I understood correctly, you have different fields there, various experts, more connected with holistic medicine. And these experts are located in different cities, so everyone can find someone for themselves, possibly in their own city, or arrange an online consultation, right?
Yes.
Is that possible?
Yes, definitely, absolutely. What's important is that we have a really great tool, the test I mentioned earlier. It's called the test of your method, because it's clear that not everyone will be ready to start from the same place, and not every method will work for everyone, right? There are really a lot of methods, dozens, if not 100. And of course, in different cities, you can do it online or in person, however you prefer, however you choose. You can also read reviews about specialists, and that's wonderful. However, the test of your method works in such a way that based on your selected or filled in answers about your health, your mental state, or your general life situation, it is designed in such a way that it directs you to a specific specialization in the area where you need change the most. So it's also a wonderful tool because right after you get your test result, you can, so to speak, read about this method. You can find out what this method is because you also receive a full set of information. Each method is described on our platform, so I highly encourage you to check it out.
That's great. It's really very interesting because I think that anyone, regardless of whether they have a problem or just feel the need, can take such a test and see what their body really needs. Sometimes we just don't know how to listen to it, even though it gives us subtle signals. But when those signals are subtle, we often don't pay attention, and we only start looking when the problem becomes really serious. And I've noticed that sometimes people don't pay attention at first to things like loneliness, anxiety, irritability, or even the early signs of depression. Many people ignore these things at the beginning because everyone thinks, I'm not going to see a psychiatrist, I'm not mentally ill. But people start to pay attention when health problems appear. Suddenly their immunity drops, or they have heart problems even at a young age, or they develop autoimmune diseases. But the problem is that when you go to a specific specialist, even if someone has Hashimoto's disease, they go to an endocrinologist because something is wrong with their thyroid. And they probably won't tell the psychologist that there were situations like that before. Even for a long time, when I felt bad, when I was lonely, I felt frustrated to look at what caused these problems, to work on that cortisol level, to address the cause itself. Because what's the point of treating the symptom if the cause remains and the problem will only get worse? So it really is very often like that. And it's worth it, if we're talking about health prevention, to do such interesting tests when there aren't any serious problems yet, and then take action. That's a great thing, so absolutely, it's really nice. I don't know what you recommend in those tests, what different methods there are. Maybe you could talk about some interesting method, maybe highlight which one it could be. It's an interesting method that many people might not have even heard of, and it's worth learning more about it.
Listen, first of all, it's great that you're talking about this and that you're asking. I'll start from the end. I'll talk about the method first, but I also want to say something about the symptoms. It's great that we're talking about this, that you're mentioning these are symptoms, right? Because they are symptoms. I'm a case where for years I struggled with stomach erosions and irritable bowel syndrome. So what turned out? Of course, those were just symptoms, nothing more. I was running from doctor to doctor, since with Hashimoto's you'd think you'd go straight to an endocrinologist, but that's not always the case. Of course, that's something everyone has to decide for themselves, but I can say from my own experience that when I dealt with my emotions and of course improved my diet, I stopped having any problems with irritable bowel syndrome, and the erosions that had been with me for years just disappeared. And after 3 months of taking medication, a month later, my stomach started hurting again, right? I thought, no, this is just impossible. It's a vicious cycle. And suddenly it turned out that when I worked on my emotions, and here we'll actually move on to maybe some methods. I highly recommend holotropic breathing. It's work on the subconscious level. Actually, all methods where we work on the subconscious level, where we reach those subconscious parts. Now, hypnotherapy is very effective, and there's a lot of talk about it. And adding such unconventional methods to psychotherapy is really great, for example, hypnotherapy, because it turns out that people now, after psychotherapy or during psychotherapy, are getting phenomenal results and speeding up their process. When it comes to working through certain things, when they use hypnotherapy, it turns out that a lot of psychotherapists are starting to train in hypnotherapy, learning how to conduct it, because it has amazing effects and we create new pathways and connections. And the brain no longer remembers that it used to follow a certain pattern and, for example, in a given situation would respond, yes, I'll do it, even though everything inside was screaming, no, don't do it. But this often comes from, for example, childhood experiences. I don't know, maybe the child had a dominant mother, right? And as an adult, the woman has trouble saying no, right? She's not very assertive, and in all of this also ends up feeling lonely, right? Because she's kind of invisible, isn't she? And suddenly it turns out that this can be completely removed through hypnotherapy in just 1 or 2 sessions, and a new one is created. We build a new connection on the subconscious level. And the problem just disappears, right? She doesn't even realize that she's behaving differently. She doesn't even know. And this is one of the methods I would highly recommend. The second method, which I mentioned as the first one, is holotropic breathing. It's a method created by Stanislav Grof. And he invented a form of therapy that shuts down the outer cortex of the brain, which is the part responsible for consciousness and control. And we reach those subconscious layers through music, the group, and shutting off our sight, right? So the sense of sight is we have our eyes closed, we wear a blindfold, loud music, and we work in a group for 3 hours. Listen, the effects are amazing. I myself took part in such sessions and I worked through a lot of things. A method that I could also highly recommend is, of course, the Access Buzz method. This is a method where there are points on the body that the therapist touches, and it also releases emotions. Emotion codes, body codes, total biology. I think you're familiar with that too, which is the connection between the body and the mind. And I highly recommend it for all the symptoms that appear. Honestly, I have to say I don't really know what I wouldn't recommend, but for starters, definitely hypnotherapy. Holotropic breathing is for those who are more advanced, more courageous, I would say, but it's also great work. Body codes, emotion codes, and for example, total biology as well, because it's also somewhat connected with body codes. Chinese medicine as well, definitely. So these are the methods I would recommend.
Well, great. There are a lot of methods. Okay, that's nice. There's a lot to choose from. But I already feel that some viewers might say, oh no, this is something so difficult, so complicated. I'm afraid of it. You know, when you mentioned that if someone is already more aware, I think they'll get interested in the topic. And what would you advise people who would like to do something to start somewhere? Yes, like you said, it's worth starting with small steps, something a person can do on their own, because for those methods you already need experts, people you have to reach out to and work with together. What can you do at home by yourself to feel better?
It's great that you're asking about this. Listen, soon we'll be launching our app for people looking for support, and after taking such a test, you'll be able to access certain methods. There will be a dedicated calming and relaxing playlist in our app, so you can, for example, and I recommend this, even if it's not with us, find a calming, relaxing playlist on YouTube. Something that works at a certain frequency, right? All you need to do is type in calm or relaxation and start from there. I think what's really important here is regularity. It's worth starting with 5 minutes a day, 5 minutes every morning, right after waking up and before going to sleep, just to calm your nervous system. I would also add a book, and I always emphasize this. Your book is brilliant, so I definitely encourage you, dear woman, if you're listening, to start with a book like that, with music, and I would add to that music as well. In a moment, when this music comes in nicely, because at the very beginning you might feel some anxiety, right? Since we're often not really with ourselves, we're overstimulated. We need to understand that today, in these times, unfortunately, we are overstimulated by everything that's happening. Stimuli from work, from children, from husbands, relationships, social media, they're just coming at us from every direction. And that's unfortunately a fact. So when we spend those 5 minutes alone with ourselves for the first week or even 2 weeks, it might turn out that anxiety appears, and I'll want to stop it. A deep breath, inhale, exhale, just find some kind of breathing technique, right? We're also working on this soon. There will be such exercises in our app. But for now, just look up or type in breathing exercises somewhere. For example, 4x4, right? So I breathe in and out 4 times. It's also good to look for such solutions. And once we get out of the house after those 2 weeks, I would generally recommend a massage, even starting with a massage. You can also find one with us or on the platform, or you can find one in your area. Maybe a friend knows a good massage therapist. Valuable advice from a friend is always welcome. So yes, it's about regulating your body a bit. What I could also suggest is that after listening to some music and doing some breathing exercises, let's move our bodies for at least 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes, that's really enough. Jump in place, get your lymph moving, right? Different types of exercises, even just moving your arms loosely for a minute. You can also find lymph movement exercises on YouTube, right? And what I would also recommend is that we are often overwhelmed. Oh God, so now I have to spend 5 minutes listening to this, 5 minutes doing that, 5 minutes on something else, and suddenly it turns into 25 minutes. No, just choose for yourself, open your eyes in the morning and think, what would I like to do for myself today? 5 minutes, if it comes to your mind to listen to music, play a song. It doesn't even have to be something meditative, because it's also about building a habit, right? So if we, so to speak, like a certain song somewhere, let's start with that one. Let's listen to it even 5 days in a row, but slowly let's find those 5 minutes for ourselves, because even those 5, it's kind of like, you know what, when I started running after pregnancy, I love running, although back then I didn't like it that much. But when I started, I would even just do 100 meters. I told myself I'll go out even just for those 100 meters. I'll put on my shoes, take the elevator down, walk to the park, run those 100 meters and sit on the bench. It doesn't matter if I just sat there. What matters is that I went out, I did it. And listen, this method works brilliantly because it helps you build a new habit in your mind consistently, even if it's just a minute of jumping, even if you just stand in front of that mirror, but just stand there, because the next day you'll stand in front of the mirror and maybe you'll move your hand, maybe you'll close your eyes, maybe you'll try to listen to music.
That's great. Listen, so many wonderful tips, but I think the main message you mentioned is that, dear ladies, and this applies to men too, you should ask yourself, what do I need today for myself, and what can I do today just for myself? Great, great, Sylvia. Thank you so much. Of course, we'll post the link to your wonderful platform below the video so that as many people as possible can benefit from it. Thank you so much for shedding light on this topic. I think more than one person will benefit from it, including those who already feel lonely or feel like something is wrong with them. And even those people for whom everything seems fine but who want to explore the topic to get to know themselves better. Thank you, my dear, and I think we will meet again with some other interesting topics.
My dear, thank you so much for the conversation as well. It was a great honor for me to be here. Thank you all.